Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome back to the series on medieval Armenian poetry. Last week we looked at Mugardich Nagash. I'm really excited about tonight's lecture because Yovhannēs Tlkurantsɣi is one of my favorite Armenian poets. He's also one of the first medieval Armenian poets I really kind of read and studied in a deeper way. This lecture is called Love and Wisdom, the Poetry of Yovhannēs Tlkurantsɣi. He was actually the very first love poet, we could say, in the Armenian poetic tradition. And so we'll get to see some really beautiful love poems, but written from the perspective of someone who was most likely a celibate monk and had to deal with the tension between his monastic vows on the one hand and his love sickness or love on the other. So there's some confusion and about who exactly he was. So there's not really any information about his life, the life of the poet. There is a figure, Yovhannēs Tlkurantsɣi, who in the late 15th, early 16th century was the Catholicos at Sis. So this is in Cilicia. So after the Catholicosate had moved back to Etchmiadzin, the Catholicosate at Sis remained, and Yovhannēs Tlkurantsɣi was one of those in this time. He was involved in sponsoring some projects in Jerusalem and things like that, but there's no real evidence that he was much of a poet or writer himself. Also, in the early 20th century, some Mochitara scholars doing research in manuscripts discovered that there were poems by this Yovhannēs Tlkurantsɣi figure in manuscripts from as early as the 14th century. These were Gonzarans and his gonzas, which are the litanies. So like liturgical poetic texts. For many, this meant, okay, so all of these works are from the 14th century, must be. However, the earliest of the Dals, which are the love poems and the other love and wisdom poems, the earliest manuscripts those show up in are in the 15th century. So it could be there's as many as 3 or 4 figures, one who wrote these litanies, another who wrote the love poems, and then the Catholicos, or it could be that there was the Catholicos on the one hand, and then this figure from the 14th century who wrote all these other poetic works. For us, it's not a big deal. It doesn't matter too much. We're more interested in just looking at the works and situating them. But it does look like they come from the 14th century Ciligian or what more Western Armenian sort of context. You can see that in the language. He also has one kind of heroic poem written about this figure, Kachliparit, who was a defender of Sis, died defending Sis late in the Ciligian Empire period. And most scholars think that was written contemporary to that time, so more evidence that it's from the 14th century. What's interesting is this is a period not so different from, what we saw in Mugardich Nagash and some of these other figures who focus so much on the devastation going on at the time, the invasions, all the devastating things we mentioned last time. But in Yovhannēs Tlkurantsɣi's poetry, you get these beautiful poems celebrating love, spring, nature, and James Russell, who studied them, talks about how he really probably used his poetry, and people turned to the poetry as a way to seek, respite from all these terrible things going on all around them. For those interested, there are two separate critical editions of his poetry. His poems were extremely popular, so they survive in lots and lots of manuscripts. Right around the same time, there was a critical edition made in Jerusalem by Archbishop Norai Bogharian, 1957, 1958, and based mostly on the manuscripts in Jerusalem. Over in Soviet Armenian, a scholar by the last name Bivazyan prepared a critical edition published in 1960, so a couple years later, and that was based mostly on the manuscripts in the Madanataran. There's actually a lot of difference between some of the poems, and it leads you to think that some of the works might have evolved over time or had different editions based on someone who was performing them or someone who was publishing or copying them. Authors at this time, especially with these poetic works, which were often sung and performed, you could have different versions made and different versions circulate for different contexts or different uses or purposes. James Russell mostly used the critical edition made in the Soviet Armenian period in his study. And it's actually interesting, this study by him, he's professor emeritus from Harvard University. This started out as his BA thesis when he was at Oxford, or B.Lit over there. And then he kind of expanded it, and it ended up being a translation and very extensive and detailed study of all the poems by Yovhannēs Tlkurantsţi, except there's a couple in the Jerusalem edition that he didn't translate. I think he maybe overlooked them or didn't notice them, or yeah, I don't know why. One of the things characteristic about Yovhannēs Tlkurantsţi is that he uses this epithet to refer to himself, chev. And chev is kind of like chent. It means crazy. But specifically the kind of craziness that comes upon people when they're in love. And so he'll be writing a poem, and almost always at the end, he refers back to himself to kind of, you could say, chastise himself, or, give monastic counsel to himself to, hey, you crazy Yovhannēs, don't follow that, do this instead, or, this kind of thing. But that is essentially his kind of like signature, and it's characteristic of poets in this period to refer to themselves at the end of their poems in Persian poetry, Turkish poetry, and he's always using his name with this epithet chev, which signals the kind of spirit or mind in which these poems are written. Has anyone heard of Tolguran as a place? Yeah, I had not either, and it was a small town of Armenian population located between Diyarbakir, Dikranagert, and Mardin. You can see in the map. It's not on this screen, but it was somewhere between those places. Here's a slightly more expanded map. And now it's apparently known as Tlkurantsţi, and it's in the sort of like Kurdistan part of this region and inhabited by Kurds. And actually the Armenian church that was there, Surp Asvadzadzin, which we know of from some colophons and people who refer to it, travelers who went there in the, I think, 19th, maybe 20th century, there's like no traces of it anymore. They don't even know where it used to be located. Well, one of the interesting things, maybe you've heard before about the very first printed books in the Armenian tradition. So, of course, the printing press, as a technology, was invented in the 15th century, so like 1452 or 3 by Gutenberg. And in many literary cultures, especially in the Middle East, they didn't start printing their books until very, very late. So the Persian tradition, definitely Arabic, they were very resistant to adopting the printing press. Why? Well, in part because the scribes were organized almost like unions. And they were like, we're going to be out of a job if you just get this printing press to replace us. Kind of like the debates today starting to rumble around about AI, artificial intelligence and workers, or autonomous driving and truck drivers, all these it was that type of situation. And printing didn't become common in the Middle East in Arabic until around the, late 18th, 19th century, that far. Well, Armenians in this time period had a very developed merchant class who had connections all across the major cities of Europe. And they were in touch with the latest technological developments and kind of early adopters of a lot of them, especially in comparison to other Middle Eastern cultures. And in regards to the printing press and printing, we see that. So the earliest Armenian printed books were printed in 1512, 1513. So only like 50 or so years after the invention of the printing press, which is very early in comparison to other cultures, especially that had a different alphabet. It's not so easy. You have to develop fonts and types and do all of that. And it was done on the initiative of an Armenian. Some of the printing that started to happen for other languages was from Catholic missionary efforts, who wanted books in those languages for the purpose of trying to convert people. But Armenians were kind of like self-initiated in this process. And there's this figure, Hagot Marabard, who we don't know almost anything about, except that he published 5 Armenian books in Venice. And they were the very, very first books printed in Armenian. And then printing didn't really pick up until like 40, 50 years so after him. And then the rest is a topic for a different lecture. But one of the things about, so one of the books he printed among his 5 was a dağaran. So a collection of dağs, a collection of odes. And Yovhannēs Tlkurantsți's poetry features really strongly in the dağaran. And there's a reprint of maybe you've heard of the Urpatakirk, that was Hagot Marabard's first printed book. And then it has some similarities, actually, Matt, with some of the Humayils, the prayers and things. And then there's the dağaran, which in this publication by Gulbenkian in the 70s was basically a reprint of the manuscript, or sorry, of the early printed book. And there's many poems by Yovhannēs Tlkurantsİ in there. And what's very interesting about this early printed book, this dağaran, is the way the poems are organized. So you can see from the title, it says, Dağaran esa, hokvo yev marmino. So this is a dağaran, or book of odes, for the spirit and the body. And so the first half is devoted to poems that focused on, wisdom, the spiritual life, instruction, ethics, morality, etc. And the second half, and then there's like a transition, which is the Hanalugs, the riddles of Nersess Spring. And then the rest of the poems are basically Yovhannēs Tlkurantsİ's love poems, which focus more on, they appeal to the senses, the emotions, the passions. And so you can see that was kind of the perspective of the people putting this together. A lot of scholars, especially in the 20th century Soviet sort of influences. As we talked about in an earlier lecture, they tried to present all this poetry as if it was the beginning of secular literature, secular meaning anti-religious. And that is not the case. That's a total misreading and misunderstanding of these poets and what they were trying to do. You can see in this, even in the title here, Tlkurantsʻi Hokvoyev Marmino, the human being is composed of spirit and body. And these poems appeal to and celebrate the spirit and the body. And they're all written by, almost all of them are written by monastic figures, even the love poems and the one celebrating spring and everything like that. And they find space and room for, expressing the God-given emotions of love and passion and all these things in a worldview that is still religious and has space for that, but is trying to reconcile that with the the ethics and the view of human morality that they all subscribe to. So Yovhannēs, some of his wisdom poems are in the first half of the book, in the Hokvo part, and then his love poems are in the second part of the book. There's also poems here by Mogerdich Nagash, his poems about the Gharib, so the stranger or foreigner who's traveling around. You can imagine how that would have been particularly relevant to the people who printed and read these books, who were Armenian merchants, traveling around and feeling themselves to be strangers in another culture everywhere they went and interacted with other people in other languages. And there's also odes by Nersess Spring and others that we've looked at in this series that were printed in this very first book of odes. But Yovhannēs Tlkurantsʻi really stands out in this collection, and his poems have remained popular. And I think by looking at some of them, you'll see why. So for some of these, I put this is from that original 1512 printed edition. And then we can look at the Armenian and English next to it. And one of the characteristic things about his poetry and a lot of the texts in this form of the language is there's so many borrowings from Persian, Arabic, and Turkish, because the poems are written in a literary form of the language that was very, very close to how people spoke at that time. And as you know, even from spoken Armenian today, there's lots and lots of borrowings used, and they, unlike today, didn't feel inhibition about using those words in their writing, especially when it would fit the meter better than the Armenian word. Sometimes you see that where they'll use the Armenian word in one line and then the Persian, Turkish word in the other because it fits the meter, or maybe it had a nuance or sense that felt more appropriate to them. So let's look at this, one of the love poems. You can see here in the title, Ailpank Hovanisi Asociale Vasan Siro. So about love, poem about love. So he says, Aryeg im khub surat, pargu badiv koster zorin. Yetemagan terachten gukas, ortnyal anun ko nachshorin. So look at that. Khub, surat, nachsho. These are all words of foreign origin. Khub is good, beautiful in Persian. Surat, face, Arabic. Remember Mogerdich Nagash, here's nachsho as a verb or participle, so painter. So, come, my lovely visage, come, glory and honor to your creator. It is from Eden's paradise you come. Blessed is the name of your portrayer or painter. One other thing just to point out about the language here, look at the way come is rendered. This is James Russell's translation. In the Armenian, ari and yeg. So you can see how it's basically like in modern Eastern Armenian today, they use Ari for come. And in Western Armenian, yegur, come. And here you see both of them used together, Arieg. Ari really means rise up or get up, like harutun, resurrection. Arieg, so come. And in a lot of these Middle Armenian, you see they have features of both Eastern Armenian and Western Armenian today. Okay. Arieg arev karnanayin, arieg ashnan baidzar lusin, nis vor haim heresti ver, daset herike ins pajin. Come, son of spring, come, brilliant autumn moon, sit that I may behold your face. Your sight is sufficient lot for me. Daset pajishke hivantin, aroch chutun cherman todin, acheret zoved zarvadzin, peranet kachtzere kachtzadzin. Your sight is doctor to the sick and health to the fevered. Your eyes are a sea to the thirsty, and to the famished one your mouth is sweet. Zotzete teracht an mahutian, ihed tartsene zelad hokin, voch merani, voch zerana, voch yeresin tarna terin. Your breast is a paradise of immortality, alluring to the risen soul. Then it does not die or age, nor does its face turn jaundiced. Varvenen vorhantibis idzar yelne zorni parin. O vor surate tampure, chantmov ansne is polor darin. Zov tu sirov inerst senes, zaki kanas zaren changenin. Ov gur mi chatset kirds adze, gananch mana kan is neshtarin. Chev Yovhannēs Tlkurantsʻi, paravore is har yevzorti, alvor suraten I hochtarna, I hurn anshech ur sirelin. He whom you meet in the morning begins the day in joy. He who kisses your face rejoices all year long. He whom you call in love within flowers more than the frankincense tree. He who embraces your supple waist remains greener than the hornbeam. Crazy Yovhannēs Tlkurantsʻi, glorify the Father and the Son. The fine face turns to earth, one's beloved to the unquenchable fire. So you can see one of the interesting things just about how the poem flows is it starts at the face and kind of like moves down the body. It goes the face, and then he mentions the breast, and then the hips, essentially, or waist. And so you can see him kind of like celebrating the whole body or figure of the person, the woman that he's writing about. And there's interesting play with time too. So at the end here, like there's this emphasis on how the day or the year is consumed with, good feeling or joy by the one who meets or encounters you. Zorn, idzaryan zorni padin. So from the very beginning, like the whole day passes good, or uzpolor darin, the entire year. But then at the end, there's like a turn away from that where the temporal vision, is impacted by the eternal vision. And he sees ahead into the future where, this beauty is temporal and it's not going to last. And this beautiful face you're so infatuated with is going to decay and eventually die and turn back to earth and dust. And so don't, renounce everything that you're living for that is kind of the message. And we saw this message before in the wisdom poems by Yovhannēs and others, where this is the general message of the wisdom books of the scriptures, Solomonic books, and this kind of wisdom tradition of poetry, which is to instruct and remind people not to get carried away by temporal things, but rather to, as Christ says, store up treasure in heaven where moth doesn't destroy and rust doesn't decay. And that's basically how most of these poems go. But what's, great about them is it really gives space to celebrate and really feel just how powerful and strong, the human emotion and attraction and physical passion is. And it's not shying away from that or pretending, just trying to stuff it away. It's like, express it, get it out. You can't just stuff that inside you. We know psychologically that when you try to suppress things, it can have negative impacts on you and come back in other ways. So this is their attempt to, express it, get it out, and then, try to be able to stay true to your higher values. That's how I read them. Let's look at one other really nice one. So you can see Tlkurantsʿi Yovhannēs, so another poem by Yovhannēs. Desa batger kni keretzig, zed zare kagen vor luis guda. Desa acher zed is zover, uner kanzam udaria. Urag jagad ujoch peran, zamnu varsener hokehan. Zotsne litzad aspidag vartov, majknu tidunken kan zur jojan. So you can see a lot of the images recur, and the comparisons of, the eyes are always a sea that you're drowning in, and these kind of things, which are used in Armenian poetry. They're also used in Persian poetry of the time, Turkish, Arabic, a lot of familiar images and metaphors that are shared among these different languages. So I saw a lovely image like the light-giving sun. I saw eyes like seas and brows heavier than cloud and sea. A pale brow and splendid mouth, her locks and tresses drew out the soul. Her breast was full of white roses, her waist and back swayed more than the willow. Yalitz ihis hans hurupots, vor guvarim zorni leman. Mortzazu sumen zoruni, manatserem log ashcharagan. So look at this. She filled me with fire and flame so that I burn all day long. I forgot the learning which I had and have remained but a layman. So essentially saying, I forgot all the studying I did in the monastery because of being in love with this woman. I became no better than, a layman, a non-monastic. Astsi sirezi sovacher, naasat ahem zachesi veran. Nist vorhaim yeresti ver, arya gatsir ins herevan. I said, love me, eyes like the sea. She said, I keep my eyes to myself. Sit that I may gaze upwards at your face. Come, arise before me. Asvad vo'omer ins yachpark, vorzain yered ins badaschan. Teche menai chev gabelu, yavi shurch guki kanas kal kazan. God pitied me, brothers, that she answered me thus, else were I spellbound, wandering about more than the ferocious wolf. So essentially you can picture it as maybe he even performed or recited this poem in front of his monastic brothers. And it's a way of them to kind of share this experience that must have been common, where the monk is out in the world and he was trying to make an advance maybe on a woman and who he'd fallen in love with, and she rejected him. Maybe the monastic cloths put her off or any other reason. And he's saying, thank God had pity on me that she rejected me. Otherwise I would have been lost. I wouldn't have been able to control myself. So they're very realistic in these poems. Just a small thing to point out. This is interesting. This Yavi Shurch Gu Ki Kanas Kal Kazan. This is an abbreviation for Gu Kai. I was coming Guki, imperfect abbreviation. And notice I'm using chev here as like an adjective for I would have, he says spellbound, I would have been lovesick or tied, bound to love. Te shad te kich I hedsekem, mite ansni hudis I chapan. Na serni sirdisi nerskerta, yevyeskumenam merat taran. Whether I draw back more or less, will this fire come to an end? Such love penetrates my heart, and I remain in the trap of sin. So again, they're very, very just honest. Like, okay, the fact that she rejected me didn't make the passion or the fire burning in me go away. And like, I didn't ask for this. I didn't want it to be like this. Is it ever going to leave? You know? Perem ansenem zahni medis, u iz tjochot hurn anvachjan. Mi tazadim aiskarages vor hangaskads insvaretsan. Chev Yovhannēs Tlkurantsʻi. Tsirveis chur tivagan. Hani serdet ser ashcharis. Ortne zanech pananeagan. Wherever I go, I carry my fear and the eternal fire of hell. Will I be freed of this fire with which I was ignited unawares? To see the connection between the fire of love that's pulling him away and the fire of the afterlife that awaits him if he, loses his path. Crazy Yovhannēs Tlkurantsʻi, cast away your demonic counsel. Draw love of this world out of your heart. Bless the uncreated existent word. So again, at the end, trying to pull him up away from the bodily passions up to the spiritual plane. So these are great examples of his poems. This one is so beautiful, but I don't think we have time because there's a lot of things to do. There's one I wanted to show as an example of the wisdom poems before we look at this longer poem at the end. So this is an example of the wisdom poems. Kani tadisi had merats, anas kamart gadarats, zanchap charikit war kordatsir, heri gara, tartsir merats. How long will you abide in sin, insensate savage man? Enough of measureless evil have you done. Turn from sin. Ihatama minchevi kez shunch gentani zok che torads. Kidem cheleses chradu karots. Maravorat teinjka bahads. From Adam, no living breath has been spared from Adam down to you. I know you will not heed the advice of Scripture and that which it has preserved concerning sinners. O vodune pertukak par busani boskov zapads, hedo yeto zamenanander, nedkev horunen bargads. Whoever held fortress or city or palaces adorned with gold, later left all without their master and lies beneath the earth. So very similar to the kind of things we've seen. What's very characteristic about the wisdom poems, almost what makes them that, is death, the presence of death. So death and the afterlife, your attention is brought to them so that it will inform the way you should live in this life. And there's a reminder, again and again about, these people who lived in luxury, or the kings of old, and all these, great figures who got everything out of the world. None of it lasted, and they all died just like everyone else. Everyone comes to the same end, so don't be carried away by appearances and fleeting pleasures and things that don't last. That's the general message of these. Okay, but we don't need to finish it because I want to get to this one, which is one of the fascinating things about Yovhannēs Tlkurantsți's poetry is not only does he use, Turkish, Persian, Arabic words and borrowings here and there, but there's whole poems where there's whole sentences or dialogue in Turkish, written in the midst of the Armenian poem. He has one poem where it's about 16, 20 lines long, and every other line alternates between Armenian and Turkish. So, obviously they were bilingual, and he was aware of Turkish poetry too, and Armenian spoke Turkish then also. And so he was experimenting and created a poem that reads beautifully and it all rhymes, everything works. But one line's Armenian, the next line is Turkish, written in Armenian letters, next line Armenian, next line Turkish. I was going to show that one, but this one is just so famous and so fun that I thought, let's look at this one instead. It's a whole story, and the setting is an Armenian guy, monk, essentially, who falls in love with a Turkish girl. And it's kind of the whole interaction back and forth, between the Armenian Christian and the Turkish Muslim. Though in the manuscripts, it's called Dağ Hovanesi Fevi Asatsali Vera Aishain, Ode about Aisha by Crazy Yovhannēs. And Aisha, if anyone knows, that was the name of the Prophet Muhammad's wife. So already, even just in the name, you get this indication of kind of the religious tensions that are going to be at play, between these two different communities. And by the beginning, you can see how the poem is written as if from the, we don't know if this happened or not, or if it was just meant to be a kind of typical experience, or a paradigmatic experience, but it's written from the perspective of, this story happened and now I'm coming back to write about it. So he starts out, Ais inch garager zis edets, edets. Ais inch chavader zis badets. Yes, them an chachtei chachtets. Bogbad amur zed churhalets. What fire was this that burned me, or what darkness that enclosed me? I was an unshakable stone, she shook me. I was an iron fortress, she melted me like water. Yegavan savu joch kalets, jojiats uzmechkin godorets, tartsav hedev cholor nayets, zansis desav uzahandets. Oren shapat, okay, go to the English. She passed by me walking luxuriously. She swayed and swerved her hips. She turned back and cast a look. My soul beheld her and was awestruck. I want to mention too that the version in the two critical editions I mentioned had very significant differences. And I mentioned that Russell followed, the one prepared in Soviet Armenia. And I got really into this today and was comparing the different versions. And I thought the Jerusalem one was better in most places, but not all. So in the context of putting this together, I basically made my own critical edition. And then, of course, I had to translate it all myself to put it together. So this is my translation with a text compared from the two and the other manuscripts variants at the bottom that had maybe has never existed in this form before, but was what I thought was the best version of the text between the different ones out there. So the scene is he sees this woman and is totally struck by her. He says, Oren shapat Luis Giragi, veri vanatsani varguki, purvari tseres changei, salmosaran hantasunei. So it was the day of light, the Lord's day. I was walking about above the monastery. With censer in hand, I was sensing. Under my arm, I held a psalter. So you can see the religious aspect is really being emphasized, leading up to what's going to be a conflict, essentially, between these two religious communities. Hed gukai, hed gartai, tertam hasnim jashu jami, Yagiari hanskaragi, vochkarei vochkartai. I was walking about and chanting, heading to the Sunday synaxis. Everyone who I saw who translated this before, see how it's Jashu Jean? Teir Tamas named Jashu Jami interpreted that as I was headed to mealtime. Jashu Jam. But Jashu Jam is the way in the Armenian liturgical tradition you refer to the liturgy of the word. So that happens before the Eucharist. The first half of the Badarak, essentially, that has the gospel reading and everything like that. And he had just mentioned it was a Sunday. It was the Lord's Day. I was going about in the monastery with censer, and I was trying to make it on the way to church, essentially, is what he's saying, not to a meal. And he says, Yagiari hanskaragi vochkarei vochkarte. I came and was struck by fire, the fire of love from seeing the person. I couldn't write, I couldn't read, or maybe even couldn't recite, like do the chanting. Megmi hedzer boz bedavi, yagavan sav kachmuhali, acherune tavrezistani, unkvin izchelkis gudani. She rode a gray Arab horse. She passed by like a fierce Mongol. She had eyes that would capture Tabriz. Her eyebrows took my senses away. And then look at this. Chunsortzakets medikchari. Magmailtzakets tzadsaari. Sen musurman molaghazi. Ben ovanes keshish oli. Chunsoret ihis inch panuni. So that the two lines in italics is in Turkish, their dialogue back and forth. I don't know, Mary, maybe do you know Turkish? I know, Avo, you do. I assume it's fairly similar to modern Turkish, or understandable at least. Yeah.
Yeah.
She dropped an apple. I paid no mind. She dropped another. I bent down and picked it up. And he speaks, you are a Muslim, a mullah's daughter. I am Yovhannēs, a priest's son. What does your apple have to do with me? So basically she was flirting with him. And also it's a significant, the apple, the fruit, it takes you to Garden of Eden, the whole conflict of everything. So he's a very skillful writer. He ignored the first one, he's trying to do his best. But she did it a second time, okay, at least he's going to talk to her. But he tells her his first thing, you're a Muslim, san musulman, mullah ghazi. Mullah is like the equivalent of a vartabad. That basically like an Islamic religious scholar who studied everything, knows everything, You're a vartabad's daughter, basically, but they're married. I am Yovhannēs, a priest's son. What does your apple have to do with me? And look at her reply. Yoru gyavurugli. Gutur bizden muhalsozi, ben musurman molaghazi, sen ovanes keshish ogli, zirar sirenk, khoshgulini. So she says, come, O infidel son, enough of this senseless talk. I'm a Muslim, a mullah's daughter. You are Yovhannēs, a priest's son. Let's love each other. It'll be sweet. And it's hard to do the last line justice because the whole thing's in Turkish, back and forth, and then the last line switches to Armenian. Zirar sirenk, khosh gulimi. And khosh is like very, very colloquial, like it'll be awesome, or like it'll be great, what could go wrong, kind of thing. Hovanisi marn imana. So look at this. Haker vala ivran chuba. Zorni vanen shurchkuka uchungumom gohostana. Yovhannēs' mother finds out. Like, here we go. Dresses herself in silks and furs. Look how interesting this is. And goes about all day to the monasteries vowing incense and candles. So what's she doing? She gets dressed up, trying to look as nice as she can, puts on her fanciest clothes. She's gonna go try to attract the monks' attention, both by her physical appearance and also by promising them essentially bribes, like, I'll bring incense, candles, whatever. And please just pray for my son. Maybe it was the monastery that he was at. She says, Sargavakni, Alsek Mera, Aperani devoamia. Alachetzek is Christos asvads, teim Yovhannēs duntarna. Deacons, say, I have sinned, mera. Monks, say, Lord, have mercy. Ask Christ God for my Yovhannēs to come back home. Because I can't resist mentioning all these interesting grammatical things. Look at the plural, ni. So in Karapar it was ke. In modern Armenian, ner, and we've seen that in some of these. But this ni shows up at this time too. And this still is used in colloquial Western Armenian. We say like, Kaluchnis Artugets or something, like he ironed all our heads or whatever. He whatever. This ni as a plural is used as like a collective plural in modern Armenian, only in the spoken language, mostly in the spoken language, but we see it in Middle Armenian also. Okay. Meg mi chasats te der mera amen Allah ushedula hedo zeist jurab nasatzin Yovhannēsin al jarchiga. So she's still talking to the monks. He hasn't once said, Lord, I've sinned, like made confession for what he did. All he says now is Allah and Shahidullah. So Shahidullah is the witness of God, or which is a way of referring to Muhammad. So all he's doing now is talking all about, Islamic stuff or Muslim stuff. Then they gave her this reply. There's no hope for Yovhannēs. Like, it doesn't matter what we do. It's not going to affect him. He's in love. What are we going to do? So you know Armenian mothers. Some of you are Armenian mothers. She's not going to give up that easy. So she goes straight to her son now. And there's this whole part now. It's like a long dialogue back and forth between mother and son. And it's so great, the lines. Like, so she's always repeating the same thing over and over and over, which you can picture like, her just kind of harping on him again and again and again. Zo Yovhannēs, zo imdera, tartiridun asamera, aishan dajige zenehar, yes hai perem kezi hamar, kan zaisha eval yerlin. This could have been written like today, this language. So, hey, Yovhannēs, hey, my son, come back home, say I've sinned. Aisha is a miserable Muslim or Turk, so Dajig, which basically is in this time and modern times could mean Turk, could mean Muslim, just like Armenian is almost synonymous with Christian. So she says, Aisha is a miserable Muslim. Let me bring you an Armenian who will be better than Aisha. She has no problem with him ditching his monastic vows. That part doesn't matter. But just don't marry like a Muslim. Let me bring you an Armenian girl. I imadi mi dukhranar or mi dukhmarnar chagan namanzam Aishin Aishan tuch unkne gamad kafaram tezinken uranam. So he says, "Oh, mom, don't be silly. There's no one like Aisha. You can't find anyone as good as her. Aisha is dark, her eyebrows arched. I'd be an infidel if I renounce her." So now he's even using religious language to talk about her, as if it couldn't have gotten any worse. So she replies, again, always the same thing. Zo Yovhannēs, zo imdera, tartiridun asamera, hon ga derdere gujora, te ashan angeri hetnora. So she tries to appeal to his religious sensibilities, his priest back at the monastery. Hey, Yovhannēs, hey, my son, come back home, say I've sinned. Your priest there is angry that, like he's saying, oh, Aisha's become his companion, he'll never come back, kind of thing. He says, Ay marig, yes kudzara, teim derden gudjora, na yes ashan tzitzenem nora, kanzisu alchev gulina. So he replies, oh, mom, I'm your servant. Like he's saying, I'd do anything for you. If the priest is angry, I'll show him Aisha. He'll go crazier than me. So she says the same thing again and then says, Tu magigas al jarchika, evalina lu jarakchika. Yovhannēs, my son, come back, say I've sinned. You're my only son. There's no other way. There's no way this could be. Ay marig, yes kidara, gotten vorgera, halalara, as chelkasarin, yes chevyera, hismeikas aljar chaga. Mom, I'm your servant. I drink your milk. Forgive me. She stole away my sense. I'm lovesick. There's no cure from you to me. There's nothing you can do, to stop it. Let's just end this conversation. But she's never gonna give up. Zo Yovhannēs zo imtara, tartiri duna samera, kazi perem hayutastrik, is kaz ornel dam kahana. Let me bring you an Armenian's daughter and have the priest bless you, like have them marry you, essentially. Hi, mighty so a repeat of what was before. Lazun bulbul, saina rumri, mechken parag, zed franki. Oh, Mom, don't be silly. There's no one like Aisha. Her tongue's a nightingale, her voice a dove, her waist is thin like a Frank's. So, that, comparing to the European women who they see. Ashan Nastir. So now, that ends with no resolution at all. Could have gone on for days, months. We don't know. They could still be going back and forth. And then the scene switches to Aisha, what's going on with her. So, Ashan Panjarain, Uchistur dum Apanyeres, Taisord Zedzets in Hairgadin, Her Gusiras is Hayu Vortin, Des Tekel Nemeg Miguka, Aganshin Yovhannēsin. Aisha's seated at the window, so she's like looking out the window sad, like the perfect image of a, sad, distraught woman up in a castle, maybe, kind of thing. Very sad, her face in her palm. Today, my father, the Qadi, beat me. The Qadi is Islamic judge and a, major figure, essentially, saying, why do you love the Armenian son? So you think he's going to come? The year of Yovhannēs' death, like he doesn't care about you. So her dad beat her for initiating contact with an Armenian. Chev Yovhannēs and Yeb Zain Lasets, per Nersess Jampani hot benin, Kochi Pats Kadagan Hapin, Kanats Ganknatsav Harchev Chanin. It almost sounds like it's going to be the start of like a hero story now. It's like a knight and romance story, like I think kind of intentionally to be sort of like funny or ironic. So when crazy Yovhannēs heard this, he took to the road by foot. He can't even get on a horse. He doesn't have a horse. He's just a poor monk, and so he's going to go all that way to her, but just on foot. It's kind of like being playful, bareheaded, hat in hand, because probably he's running so fast. His hat's going to fall off. He went and stood before the Khan, so like the leader or king of that place. Parev yered takavorin, noka shudovas parev narin, pernatzes bol tsiyun akin, gafa asat amansadin. So he greeted the king, they quickly made their salutations. He grabbed the gray horse by the tail and recited kafas through every valley. Kafas are poems. So essentially like, I don't know what happened with the horse. Like, did he steal the horse or just he was given the horse by the Khan? He has this horse now and he's going after her and he's singing love songs to himself the whole road long. So Ashan Gankner Ivera Pertin, Medigner Yovhannēsin, Kovne Gankner Telin Haknolen, Inkenes Gananchin Uz Ziranin. So Yovhannēs Medigara Ivera Pertin Inchkuchara, Pelin Vodin Yesem Zara, Gananch Vodin Zanu Nasa. Teche linim shahin paza, terchim nestim tevit vera, babu sanu asen mula, ach podas asen kachki shahna. Okay, so Aisha stood atop the fortress listening to Yovhannēs, so who came. I think there's some problems with the text at this point, because some of the things like don't really make sense. So standing beside her was a woman dressed in yellow, while she herself was dressed in green and purple. And then I don't know if this is the narrator's voice or what. Hey, Yovhannēs, listen to what is happening atop the fortress. And then he says, "Oh, you clothed in yellow, I am your servant." So to her sister. And then he says, "Tell me the name of the one wearing green." So he addresses himself to like the person standing beside her and says, "I'm your servant. I'd do anything for you. What's the name of the girl next to you?" Because you didn't even know her name at this point, apparently. "Otherwise, I'll be the Shah's falcon and fly up and sit on your arm." Okay, and then Aisha responds, "My grandfather's name they call Mullah. My brother is called the city's Shah." So her grandfather's a Mullah, like religious scholar. Her brother's the Shah of the city, so he's in charge, the mayor. So you should be thinking at this point at the audience, like, oh crap, like he's really screwed now, is essentially like the message trying to be given. Yevzim anunas asen asha, magal kuroche suluta, zimor nanunasen fatma, uhoris asen ghadi mola. So my name they call Aisha, my sister is Zulutha, my mother's name they call Fatima. These are all like major figures in Islam. So everyone, it's like the most religious family you ever could have found, and then all leading up to, and my father's name they call Qadi Mullah. So that's not even a name, that's his title. They don't even use his name. That would be too familiar. They call him, scholar judge. Like it's meant to send shivers down your back, essentially. But that doesn't deter him. He says, "Yevhannēs yes kidzara, tu im chotzus jarmiara, teche hokis kagda vemera, zedmomi deres haletza." And he introduces himself. "Well, I'm crazy Yovhannēs, your servant." This whole litany of people. He's like, "Well, I'm just a lovesick person." "Make a cure for my wound. Otherwise, my soul will dissolve and I'll die. Like a candle, I'll melt in my place." So just really laying it on thick. "Zo Yovhannēs mezgit matnu bidis, matnikti vergalnu bidis, head molanun shurch kal bidis, habadzotus dergulinis." So this is her reply to him. "Okay, Yovhannēs, you must enter the mosque if you want me to become your, girl or whatever. You must enter the mosque and must raise your finger, maybe like make a vow, profess Islam, and must go around with the mullahs. Then you can be lord of my bosom." And here's where you see that like it's really meant to give a lesson to the reader with the ending. So, "Asha seret in haram lina, te ait paneret hanskulina, asha kutnus horeti mahun, zinch chanatzir het im habdun, uta ganam salmos usa, zan aliko sirut morza, or mi chasi te der mera, amen Allah ushehtala." So, "Aisha, may your love be forbidden me if those things you said must be. Like if I would have to do those things to get your love. Aisha, may you meet your day of death for trying to turn me from my faith." So I don't know. To me, it doesn't read as super believable at this point. It's kind of like the narrator interjecting with like, it's like, okay, this is what you're supposed to do. Like it's meant to be exemplary or a kind of lesson to like to the reader. So, and then you can see like, okay, he was emphasizing so much how in love he was just to come to this message at the end, like, no matter what, don't trade your faith for that. And he comes back, "I learned all 8 canons of Psalms." This is again a liturgical thing where the book of Psalms, so all 150 is divided into 8 different sections. And originally one of those sections was sung in the Kisherayim Jam, in the night hour, the whole thing. So every 8 days you would do the whole Psalter. And the monks would memorize the entire Psalter. So he says, "I learned all 8 of these. I memorized the whole Psalter, but I forgot them all for love of you." Not one day did I say, Lord, I've sinned. It was all just Allah and Shahidullah. So kind of repeating back what his mother had said. And this apparently is her reply in one of the endings. There's like a different ending in one of the other versions where it doesn't, it's a little different, but this, I don't know, this one seemed to make the most sense. Yovhannēs pokri horats zander I chelats ches uranares ko asvads chilesetzir tu mechosats. So either her voice, her voice. Aisha, hey Yovhannēs, young of days, weighty of mind. You won't deny your God. You didn't listen to a single word, almost like she was testing him or something. And then her final lines, this is hilarious, I think. Kana shine yegeretzi, borkam matnum gosh govsi ners. Besagtanen is mez ortnen, tol kuserdin gamkanlini. And that's how it ends. Go and make ready a church where I can come and enter in with shoes. Because, in the mosques, they don't wear shoes. So it's like emphasizing the, religious practices differences. Go and get ready a church where I can come and enter in with shoes, where they can crown and bless us. So in the wedding service, they put the crowns on. Let the desire of your heart be fulfilled. So essentially, like the moral of it, or for the Armenian readers of the time, it's like it's a win, because okay, it's a win-win. They ended up in love, like they were in love. He stood the test. He didn't, fall for her religion, and she essentially came over to his side instead. That's like ideal win-win perspective from from the perspective of the writer. And we know, of course, from history that like everything was more complicated than that. It went both ways. There was actually lots of or cases of intermarriage, sometimes one way, sometimes the other. But this is just such a fascinating poem on so many levels, and so fun to read, both the language and just what it reveals about society of the time, people's mindsets, everything. And I hope you all enjoyed it as much as I did. And next week we will look at Nahabed, or Kuchak, and Haydaner. So they're also kind of like love, or more like joyful poems that in a particular meter called Hayran, which was a very specific like Armenian sort of meter. And that'll be the second to last lecture. And in the last lecture, we're going to look at Sayat Nova and the kind of early modern like Ashur minstrel tradition. And we can end there and take any questions or just comments if there are any.